So thank you all for being here this evening. It's really exciting to be here in Toronto to present what Cameron said is now the third iteration of Black Star, following its debut in London in October 2016 and its follow-up at MoMA in New York in April this year. I'm really pleased that this edition of Black Star has a local flavour to it, with the Canadian sidebar or section programmed by Ella Cooper. And I'm really excited myself to find out more about Black Canadian cinema. So Black Star generally is intended as many things: a conversation starter, a way into understanding how the black image has been deliberately constructed on screen within the Hollywood machinery, and also how it's been combated from outside, from trailblazing bold performers working inside and outside the industry. It's a celebration of the art of acting, and it's a chance to question the notion, of authorship itself. After all, in an industry where, because of so many systemic hurdles and systemic racism, black directors and screenwriters and producers have found it very difficult to gain a foothold and traction, it strikes me that there is more weight placed upon black stars to convey inner meaning and complexity. It's also a chance to see some fantastic and sadly overlooked films on the big screen where they should be seen. And it's an unambiguous corrective, as Cameron writes in his great introductory essay, to the ongoing and widespread erasure and disrespect of black life, which manifests in cinema and beyond. Cameron writes, to put black subjects at the center of cinema, to make blackness the focus of identification and worship that defines film stardom, is to take it as a given that black lives matter. So, if we can put the first slide on, please. Very shortly, you'll be treated to a new 4K restoration of the classic film In the Heat of the Night, directed by Norman Jewison and starring Rod Steiger, and of course, the man himself, Sidney Poitier, as the one and only Mr. Virgil Tibbs. This is a 50th anniversary screening of the film. It first came out in 1967. Is anyone in here seeing it for the first time? Raise your hand. Great. That's always good to see some new people to this. It's a wonderful film. But before we begin the film, I'd like to speak a little about Sidney Poitier, a figure in whom so many of the complexities and challenges of the concept of black stardom are contained. He was, I think it's fair to say, the first African-American performer to rise to a certain level of prominence, taking roles of a dramatic caliber that had hitherto been denied to black performers. As Cameron mentioned before, these are predominantly stereotyped and limited roles. The film that screens here at the Lightbox on Sunday at 3:45, Ethnic Notions, by the late great documentarian Marlon Riggs, goes into that in forensic and poetic detail. I'm talking about black stereotypes like wily criminals and savage brutes, smooth entertainers with loose morals, simple-minded comic relief, and maids, or the mammy stereotype, domestic servants. Speaking of which, this is Hattie McDaniel, who became the first black woman to win an Oscar in 1940 for her role as a domestic servant, or the aforementioned mammy, in the film Gone with the Wind. Now, at the Oscar ceremony, she had to sit at a segregated table in what was normally a no-blacks hotel in LA. So that just shows you how deep this goes off the screen and into real life, and the industrial realities that black performers had to face. But here is Sidney Poitier, alongside Diane Carroll, gracing the cover of Ebony magazine in 1961. Time's short, so I won't give you a whole biographical history about the man. Wikipedia is your friend for that. But a few interesting details. Sidney Poitier was born in Miami in 1927, oddly enough, just 9 days after his sometime friend, sometime enemy, Harry Belafonte, who was born in Harlem. Poitier grew up in the Bahamas, but at 15 was sent back to the United States by his family to live with his brother, and I do hope they got on. He did many odd jobs, including work as a dishwasher, and he served in the army for a time, all the while discovering a real taste for performing. He performed at the fabled North American Negro Chicken Club. Anyone heard of that? But he was rejected by audience because he was completely tone deaf and he couldn't sing. and people didn't want to know, but he worked at his voice and his projection, and he started making waves on stage. He made his film debut in 1950 in a great little noir thriller called No Way Out, playing a dignified professional black man under constant attack from a thin-skinned, blonde-haired serial liar and psychotic racist. Sorry, that was the wrong slide. I don't know how that got there. But his biggest breakthrough was in the movie Blackboard Jungle in 1955, where he acted as one of the troubled students in a high school class. His career built and built, slowly but surely. However, for his evident charisma and good looks, Poitier was never really allowed to be a sex symbol on screen, like his white counterparts Paul Newman, Robert Redford, and Marlon Brando. In a film called The Longships from 1964, we find Poitier giving it some James Brown in the first instance. And we also find the most ridiculous and humiliating example of the narrative contrivances that were deliberately designed to uphold the all-important protocols of white sexuality through Hollywood's erasure of Poitier's sexuality. In this film, he stars as a Moorish prince with an extensive coterie of beautiful women by his side, but at the start of the movie, he declares a vow of celibacy, which is kind of crazy. When Poitier won his first Oscar for Lilies of the Field, I like that guy's face, by the way, he became the first African-American to win the Best Actor award. And he did this months before the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed. Now, this supposedly, at least, outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. It was the first part of two consecutive major civil rights pieces of legislation. Ava DuVernay's film Selma, about Martin Luther King, shows you the lead up to the second one, which was the Voting Rights Act of 1965. But what I'm interested in exploring here a little more is something I alluded to a moment ago, specifically regarding black stardom. What is it like to be the only one? 1967 was a big year for Sidney Poitier. He starred in 3 major films, To Sir with Love, in which he plays an American school teacher in the East End of London, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, where he plays a conveniently widowed physician who falls in love with a nice white lady and must prove that their love is true to not one but 2 sets of concerned and prejudiced parents. And tonight's film, In the Heat of the Night. In this film, you will see Sidney Poitier at his most Sidney Poitier-like. He's a fascinating performer and always has been to me. He's a little stiff and stilted, flinty. There's a slight artificiality to his performance, and yet there's a palpable sense of anger underneath everything that he does in this film. He played this role and all of his other roles with real grace and dignity and respect. And as a side note, it's worth pointing out that Rod Steiger won the Best Actor Oscar for this film, and Sidney Poitier wasn't even nominated. And it was ever thus, unfortunately. Even so, Poitier was showing white America what a black actor could bring to the table. And because of this, Poitier gained the responsibility of being a kind of black ambassador to Hollywood, the lonely bearer, in mainstream cinema terms at least, of pretty much the full weight of black representation on the Hollywood screen. And this now, as I say, was after the civil rights movement's major legislative victories, and in a time when more radical ideas were in the air. So we're talking about Stokely Carmichael and Black Power, the Black Panther Party, and radical consciousness, and so on. So despite his success, 1967 is also when people start to really turn on Sidney Poitier. Many white critics dismissed his work as corny or superficial, and some black critics really put the boot in also. For the strongest example, I'd urge you to read Clifford Mason's essay in the New York Times entitled, "Why Does White America Love Sidney Poitier So?" And here's an excerpt, and I apologize for the language in advance. Open quote, "In all of these films, he's been a showcase nigger who is given a clean suit and a complete purity of motivation, so that, like a mistreated puppy, he has all the sympathy on his side, and all those mean whites are just so many Simon Legrees," end quote. And Legree, of course, is a character from the novel Uncle Tom's Cabin. Well, in response to that, I'd like to read something a little more nuanced by Poitier's friend and sometime critic, James Baldwin. And this is a slightly longer quote, but I think it's really worth reading in full because it unlocks a lot of things that we're going to be looking at this program at large. The quote begins, "The industry is compelled, given the way it is built, to present to the American people a self-perpetuating fantasy of American life. And the black face, truthfully reflected, is not only no part of this dream, it is antithetical to it. And this puts the black performer in a rather grim bind. He knows on the one hand that if the reality of a black man's life were on that screen, it would destroy the fantasy totally. And on the other hand, he really has no right not to appear, not only because he must work, but for all those people who need to see him. By the use of his own person, he must smuggle in a reality that he knows is not in the script." And that's end quote. And speaking of smuggling, there's a famous scene in The Heat of the Night when an old white man who looks a bit like Dick Cheney slaps Tibbs around the face, and Tibbs slaps him right back. What did the five fingers say to the face? And in his autobiography, Poitier explains that he, and not the director Norman Jewison, added the retaliation to the script. He writes that a black man solving the murder of a white person in deep Mississippi represented progress that, open quote, didn't come from unbridled rage any more than it came from polite submission. Progress then and now comes from the collision of powerful forces within the hearts of those who strive for it. Anger and charity, love and hate, pride and shame, broken down and reassembled in an igneous process that yields a fierce resolve, end quote. So an igneous process that yields a fierce resolve. And I think those are some wise and poetic words to keep in mind when thinking about this film, and also the process of what it means to become and to maintain a presence as a black star. Thank you. So I think I've taken quite enough of your time this evening. So please do sit back, relax, switch off your phones, and be transported to another place and time by In the Heat of the Night. Thank you for listening.